The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we are now about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks away from when the IMF and the World Bank wrapped up their spring meetings in Washington. This is their annual confab where development finance professionals from around the world come and talk about all of the latest issues in debt, in refinancing, reconstruction, all these great things that we love to talk about on the show all the time, but get quite nerdy, actually. Now, there was a lot of discussion this time about China and a lot of word that we were getting from those meetings that said there was a breakthrough of some kind, that the Chinese had pulled back from their insistence that the multilateral development banks, namely the World Bank, take losses on their loans to low-income countries. We didn't get any details about that, but again, a lot of positive encouragement coming out of these meetings. The problem is, though, is that substantively, there's been no real functional change, that we didn't get any major announcements, we didn't get any details out of it. And what we were left with was a lot of confusing messages. Let me just quickly bring you up to date about Zambia, because I know that's a country that was discussed a lot in Washington and also was on the minds of a lot of people who follow this story quite closely. The Zambian government said it's going to send its first fully formed debt restructuring plan to China and other bilateral creditors very soon. Now, that's according to a report by Reuters. Reuters also reported this week that Zambia's official creditors are now very close to signing an MOU on debt relief. Apparently, that, too, is a very big step. So Zambia is inching ever so slowly forward, but again, still waiting for a formal announcement. At the same time, while there's confusion about what came out of Washington, there is more confusion that's happening in West Africa in particular, but across the continent about the state of Chinese debt. We started seeing last week surfacing reports that Nigeria had defaulted on a part of its debt. That was a story that took off in the media quite quickly and then also on social media. Cobus, though, as you started to report last week for our subscribers, it turns out that that wasn't true.
Yeah, it seems like that was a false story, that there wasn't any default on any Chinese loan. And what's interesting is that the Debt Management Office then pushed back against it and, kind of pointing out that there's a real kind of like disjuncture between the headline, which was, weird, like Nigeria defaulted on a Chinese loan, and the body of the story, which didn't really kind of say the same thing. It's also interesting because Chinese debt only makes up a fraction of Nigeria's total debt, around 4% of the debt total. But what I found very revealing is that there's a lot of things to be alarmed about in relation to Nigerian debt, particularly like new commercial rated lending, that is significantly adding to Nigeria's total debt toll. Of those problems, Chinese debt isn't a big one. Nigeria doesn't have a particularly big Chinese debt problem compared to other African countries. But it is interesting that the Nigerian press has repeatedly defaulted to this kind of moral panic about Chinese debt, whereas other lending is kind of left off the table in this discussion. And as a media studies person, it struck me that this is possibly partly due to the success of the originally Indian, but mostly driven by the US, is that the narrative of the Chinese debt trap, which we've debunked many times. But it seems to be an indication that as a form of disinformation, it's working, in the Nigerian case at least.
And just to be sure, this is not uniquely an American phenomena or even a Nigerian phenomena, but just as a headline from Monday of this week on Radio France International's website, my former employer, here's their headline: France, Japan, India team up to rescue Sri Lanka from China debt trap. So there you have it. You're right. The durability of that narrative is incredibly strong, and it really does now bleed into misinformation because it just diverts from the real subject at hand and the real issue at hand here. Let's quickly go back to what the Debt Management Office said. And again, I give a lot of props to the DMO in Nigeria. If you follow these issues, these guys are, I would say, hands down the best in all of Africa at publishing clear, concise, transparent information about Nigeria's debt. They're also very good at rebutting these fake narratives that come out. And again, you pointed out that they noticed the discrepancy between the headline and the body of the story. And within hours, they issued a statement both on Twitter and on their website that this story should be disregarded, is what they said. It's not true. There has been no default on Chinese debt in Nigeria. Very important. What this all speaks to, though, is the confusion that people have now about where we are in terms of China, bilateral debt, the reconstruction of developing country debt, coming out of the IMF World Bank spring meetings, now with the media. And what we're going to do this week is something a little bit different than what we've done in the past, because we're trying to understand what is going on. And I'll be honest with you, few people cover this as closely as we do, and we really don't have clarity. So we thought it would be good this week to talk to people who are in the room, who study these things, who talk to the people that know what's going on, so that we can bring that to you. So we've got 2 shows this week dedicated to doing that. Our first show today is going to be with Kevin Gallagher, who's the director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. He writes a lot on this. He was in D.C., and he was literally in the room with key stakeholders. Then on Friday, we're going to have another show with 2 more experts on this to give you, again, another perspective on it. What you're going to hear from all of the guests this week is not good, is a little bit discouraging, that we're not making the progress we need, and it's problematic. Let's start our conversations this week on China, debt, and the global debt reconstruction issue with Kevin Gallagher from the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. Kevin Gallagher, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you on, timely as always, given everything that's been going on.
Great to be here, folks.
So, Kevin, you attended the spring meetings in Washington. You had a front row seat. You had a chance to talk with a lot of different people. We're struggling to figure out what actually happened, what came out of this. There was a lot of talk of a breakthrough regarding the Chinese, but there was no formal announcement. We don't really have clarity on this. Can you give us a little bit of insight based on you actually being in the room with some of these people, what happened and what the outcomes were?
Well, the one thing that's clear is that there is now an official and somewhat institutionalized, what's now called a Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, or the GSDR, where the Indians, as the chair of the G20, the IMF and the World Bank, are co-chairing a institutionalized set of conversations that are more at the 30,000-foot level about the broader crisis, rather than just having these kinds of conversations in a case-by-case level, whether it be at a table with Chad, a table with Zambia, or a table in Suriname. The GSDR, as it's called, is pretty wide-ranging. It has the major international institutions in the IMF and the World Bank. It also has significant creditor groups, both private creditors and Chinese official and commercial creditors as part of it, in addition to a handful of debtor countries. And so it's a opportunity to have a conversation about some of the sticking points and flaws in the common framework. To start on the positive side, I'd say, is that last week, it's now clear and out in the open that the common framework is flawed, that an increasing number of countries are at or near debt distress, but they're reluctant to engage in the mechanisms to restructure their debts because of no clear path to get to the other side, and that there is one step forward in this global sovereign debt roundtable to at least start talking about it. But time is of the essence, and the majority of developing countries that are in distress, 2023, 2024, and for some 2025 are when the biggest bills get paid. So we've got to turn this step forward into a sprint.
But if I could push you a little bit on just this question of what came out of it, because the Global Debt Roundtable was something we knew going into the spring meetings. They had already met at the G20 summit in India. So what specifically came out of the spring meetings that everybody was talking about in terms of a breakthrough specifically related to the Chinese?
Yeah, the potential breakthrough on the Chinese, it is a little vague because none of the official statements from China or the roundtable hint this, but news reports say that China's insistence that the multilateral development banks, which are the second largest creditor class to developing countries in debt distress, play a role in the common framework. The G20 communiques that established the common framework said that the MDBs have to play a role, and they hadn't yet. China originally had said that multilateral development banks should take haircuts and re-profile debt. And what the breakthrough might be, from what I've heard, is that if the multilateral development banks commit to make grants and to make concessional loans to the countries in debt distress, that China would agree to have a more meaningful role at the table, knowing that the MDBs are playing that key role. That would be a big step forward for the MDBs. They've been sitting on the sidelines. It's very important at this time in the world where we need to be mobilizing $1 trillion per year for developing countries in between now and 2030 to meet our climate and development goals, that MDBs maintain their preferred creditor status and their AAA status. And so this is one of the ways that they could do that, by doing more grants and doing more concessional finance into the countries that are in the most debt distress. There's still some problems with that, one being that if the countries take the grant from the World Bank and go pay PIMCO, that's not really going to help a country get back on its feet. So the larger question is, does this open the door for China and the private bondholders, being the biggest creditors to developing countries? Will they now feel like everyone's at the table and stop pointing fingers and move forward to make the real reductions in the amount of debt that developing countries can carry into the 2030?
So one of the details from all of this reporting that confused me was, in addition to these additional payments from multilateral development banks, one of the other points that I saw Chinese stakeholders raise is for faster and more comprehensive sharing of information, particularly also from World Bank and IMF, sustainability studies, that information should be shared quicker. At the same time, we're also seeing, kind of people very high up, including US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, for example, complaining about a lack of information sharing from the Chinese and like the very high levels of opacity, among the Chinese. And I've also seen, I think, Bloomberg reporting today or yesterday that bondholders are complaining about about a lack of information, a lack of transparency, and that they're kind of kept out of the loop and so on. So how are these people not sharing information? Like, what are the barriers to full transparency?
Well, number one is debt transparency about who owes what to whom and by when and what interest rate. And there's been a lot of reporting on this podcast about the relative lack of transparency on the China end. And our center, the Global Development Policy Center, has a whole program called Data Analysis for Transparency and Accountability, where we try to track Chinese overseas loan commitments. But at this table, it's not really about the commitments. It's what do you owe to whom and at what interest rate and by when. And the big concern is that the table is set by the International Monetary Fund in any restructuring. They do something what's called a debt sustainability analysis, and everybody hates it. The Chinese hate it, the private bondholders hate it, and those of us in the sort of development community are really concerned about it as well. It makes overly rosy predictions about some things. It makes best guesses about debt burdens on others. But a debt sustainability analysis by the IMF says, here is the envelope here. Here is the level of debt that needs to be reduced in order to get this country back on its feet. And then it's supposed to be the sort of envelope that the creditors then say, okay, well, let's negotiate to get this country to that level. And the private bondholders sometimes think that the amount of haircut is too big, whereas folks in the developing world think it's too small. And so there's lots of fighting about what that number should be. And the IMF to date has really just published a study, showed it with the official creditors and the country during the financial assurances period of a negotiation, leaving the general public and even the private sector creditors in the dark until a later moment. And then not really trying to keep everybody in line to get to that number. Then politics gets in the way, and you see a tragic outcome, like in the case of Chad, where there's no real debt restructuring at all, and it's all based on a prediction that Chad will grow and that the interest rate that they'll pay on their loans is 5%, and that the oil price will stay high, and we can all just cross our fingers and hope Chad doesn't come back. So in a proposal that I'm part of called Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery, we join that choir in saying that perhaps one of the most important first things that needs to be done is a reform and a more transparent use of the debt sustainability analysis. We think that the debt sustainability analysis should not be trebled just to get Chad back on its feet to the anemic levels of spending and resource mobilization it had in 2019, that in a world where we've all committed to meet sustainable development goals and Paris Agreement commitments by 2030, that these DSAs should be calibrated to getting countries to the level of spending and resource mobilization that they need to grow in a sustainable and equitable manner, and in a way that isn't going to cause them to crawl back to these mechanisms months or years down the line.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but was it not BlackRock that was insisting that Chad forego the debt restructuring because it said the oil prices were going up?
Yeah, but they pointed to some of the scenarios in the debt sustainability analysis. Yeah, the Chad situation is a real tragedy. It's heralded as a success because unlike Zambia, that's just still sitting at the table while the people suffer, Chad deal is quote unquote over, but no haircut at all. And as you said, pegged to what will need to be a stranded asset and not the cornerstone of any country's foreign exchange and economy moving into the 21st century.
Okay, if I could just go back to the earlier part of our conversation, because I'm still trying to get my head around about this supposed breakthrough that happened here. So what you said, and this is what the reporting also said, was that the Chinese relented on their insistence that the multilateral development banks, and specifically we're talking about the World Bank, they focused a little bit of attention on the IMF, but they had their sights set on the World Bank specifically, that they said, okay, you don't have to take losses on your loans. You can preserve your preferred creditor status. Great. The Chinese made a concession there, according to their insistence on that. But when they say what they got back in return was more grants from the AFDB or from other multilateral development banks, I don't understand how that's a concession to the Chinese. I don't see how that's working here. And the other part of this is that sources we spoke to, and I'm sure you've spoken to Chinese sources as well who've said the same thing, are frustrated about the World Bank in particular, that they see it as an extension of U.S. power and as part of the Bretton Woods institutions. And there is a little bit of insecurity in Beijing that the United States is exerting control over this process, and they don't like that. So there's geopolitics that are mixed up in this as well. And that's why I couldn't get my head around this idea that the Chinese were making a concession and not getting anything in return, like a greater say at the IMF or the World Bank or something tangible.
Again, I wasn't at that table, and there is a real disconnect between the reporting, even in the most serious sources around international finance, and the official statements and the conversations that you have on the sidelines with all these folks. If that's true, I'd really like to see it. Will the World Bank and IDA give more grants or really concessional loans? There's a whole other conversation that went on last week about the World Bank evolution. And the World Bank doesn't have the capacity to give a lot more grants and concessional finance. There's been a whole conversation about the capital adequacy framework and the need to stretch World Bank balance sheets because they've been sitting on too much of them since the financial crisis. But all that came out of that was changing the equity loan ratio from 20% to 19%, which will get us about $5 billion a year more in lending, but that is at non-concessional rates, not grants and concessional finance. What it would take to really increase the level of grants and concessional finance would be a stepwise increase in the capital base of the World Bank, which the U.S. is saying, let's do some of these smaller tweaks first and then talk about a capital increase, which China, to its credit, is a strong proponent of. But with all due respect to the United States, I see no appetite for the United States, and they've said it pretty loudly, in a capital increase this year. And next year is an election, and the appetite for a capital increase in the United States, which is the largest shareholder, won't come next year either. So that's why I think that there's a lot of vagueness in these statements, Maybe there's just a good faith effort to have more conversations, which is good to have it all in the open. But as you quoted earlier, the people in Zambia have been struggling for 2 years, and we estimate that there's upwards of 69 countries that need debt treatment, and all of them are just waiting on the fence and cutting spending at alarming rates in order to be able to pay international bondholders. And when you're cutting spending, you're doing the reverse of what needs to be doing. You're cutting corners on health and education, on trying to transform your economy into one that's more low carbon and socially inclusive and climate resilient. This is the mode that developing countries are in right now, while the largest shareholders of these international institutions are dragging their feet and pointing fingers and playing geopolitics. The Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable was one step forward, but the G7 communique that came out just last night is a step backward. There's hardly any conversation about this. It doesn't even mention the roundtable, it doesn't have a sense of urgency about the rising cost of capital and the massive resource mobilization needs and the reduction in our growth forecasts moving forward. The major shareholders and the major advanced economies, which are indirectly responsible for the debt crisis, are not acting and not leading.
On this theme of how they are not kind of spending the money in places where they should be, kind of how much kind of new thinking should we expect from the IMF in relation to these issues? Because, the IMF became notorious in the 90s, in the 80s and 90s for imposing these massive structural adjustments, which then had kind of knock-on effects of really bad educational outcomes and health outcomes in many global south countries. All of these countries that are waiting for debt treatment, will they be kind of expected to have IMF austerity programs kind of imposed on them? And is these kind of spending cuts that you were pointing out essentially them doing it, ahead of the IMF imposing it on them?
Yeah, they're all doing it ahead of the IMF imposing it on them. And this is one of the core concerns that China has that Eric was referring to. They're a small shareholder, even though they are 17% of the world economy. They're less than 10% of the vote in the International Monetary Fund. China's always had an issue with the fiscal consolidation, or as you call it, austerity approach of IMF lending, which still is the approach. What's fascinating is the IMF came out with its World Economic Outlook last week, where it shows that fiscal consolidation or austerity programs is not correlated with reducing debt distress because those programs reduce growth. Obviously, if you're going to slow growth, there's going to be less of a tax base to raise revenue for public spending and to pay back international creditors. So on the one hand, they're taking a step forward and realizing the empirical evidence that austerity is not correlated with alleviating debt distress, but it isn't turning around and changing the nature of its programs. So this is a real problem. The IMF is in need of real reform. And so if you're China, and I don't want to make excuses for China, all creditors need to make drastic haircuts across the world. It is important for global growth. If you have 70 countries in the world that are growing less than output or potential output, that's a drag on global growth. It's also a moral tragedy for all the poverty that is increasing as we speak. And the costs of inaction on addressing our climate change needs are going to hurt some of our larger economies really hard. So China needs to play a core role here. But if you look at it from their perspective, a country has to first get a DSA from the IMF. If the IMF says, gosh, this country not only needs an IMF program, we can't give them an IMF program until after there's restructuring. There's restructuring, and then there's an IMF austerity program, which is going to slow growth for the country and not necessarily put them on the right path. It makes it difficult for China to really roll up its sleeves and get involved here. I think there's a Western narrative that the IMF works perfectly well and that countries just need to go to the IMF and tighten up their belts and they'll get to the other side and be in a much better position. And as an academic, that's completely wrong. The overwhelming academic research shows that IMF austerity programs are not correlated with creditworthiness, not correlated with long-run economic growth, and in fact, they are strongly correlated with reductions in health and education spending, and really are politically troublesome in countries. Just a couple of years ago, because of an IMF austerity program, the country of Ecuador had to move its capital from Quito to Guayaquil. So the IMF needs deep reform. One of the great things that the G20 did recognizing some of these problems, was issue special drawing rights in 2021, which were forms of liquidity that went to countries without any of the kinds of IMF conditionalities that you have. So this narrative that the order is what should be handling this, and that China is either, raising questions about the role of MDBs or giving bailout loans or giving swap lines as some threat to a perfectly working order, it's healthy competition and China taking care of its own interests when the West is dragging its feet. And, we can't do all this overnight, but the IMF is serious flawed here. I mean, last thing I'll say on this is look at Africa. In 2020, countries should have gone to the International Monetary Fund to get liquidity finance so that they could combat the virus and get their countries in better shape. Interest rates at the IMF are 1 or 2%, but they didn't. They only went for a little bit of money from the IMF in their non-conditional programs. Instead, they went to private capital markets at 9 and 10%. That's somewhat irresponsible, because if there's no way you're going to grow at 9 or 10% in these times, and you really need to have a growth rate that is larger than the weighted average of the interest rate on your external debts to avoid a debt overhang and have, decades of slow or no growth. But because the IMF is so flawed, countries in Africa and across the developing world went to China at 5% and went to private bond markets at 9 or 10%. Only now are they lining up at the IMF after the private capital markets are well over 10% now, and it would be crazy and somewhat irresponsible to go back to those. And the Chinese aren't lending so much anymore, and their rates are 5-6%, which are a little higher than where they're at. And countries are on the brink of default, and so they're crawling into the IMF, and they're going to have these IMF austerity programs, which are not aligned with our Paris climate agreements or the Sustainable Development Goals. And it is going to put a drag on global growth, and we're all going to pay the costs of not making the proper investments into a low-carbon, socially inclusive, and climate-resilient growth path for the developing world.
I'm so glad you brought up these issues about the IMF, because I was talking to a scholar here in Vietnam the other day who reminded me that memories are still very fresh in Asia of the IMF structural adjustment programs in the late 90s here. And then recall that just a couple of weeks ago, Nigeria's vice president said that memories throughout Africa, bitter memories of the IMF structural adjustment programs, are also fresh. And then just 2 weeks ago, Tunisia's president turned away an IMF rescue deal because he didn't want to deal with the intervention from the IMF. So the IMF is a very, very sensitive topic in much of the global South. And it speaks to this discrepancy oftentimes in terms of the agendas. And we're talking about reform. So David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, is going to be leaving his post sometime before June. China has already expressed its displeasure with the candidate who is there to replace him and said that they asked, can we look at some other candidates? Well, China doesn't have the voting power in the World Bank to do that. It looks like Ajay Banja, I think is his name, is going to win the post. However, it was South Africa's finance minister that pushed back on the narratives coming out of Europe and the United States about having the World Bank focus more on climate issues. And the South African finance minister said, no, we need the World Bank to focus on hard infrastructure, in part because the Chinese are not lending as much. This is right up your alley. You focus on climate finance quite a bit. Talk to us a little bit about the struggles that are going on within the World Bank and even the IMF to some extent about how to balance the needs for basic infrastructure and then at the same time how to produce, climate-friendly financing that won't exacerbate the climate crisis.
Yeah, well, there's a little bit of a false dichotomy between sort of climate and development that I think we all need to think a little bit harder about. I really want to recommend a new paper by the Brookings Institution by Homi Karas and Charlotte Brevard, where they model that if the IMF and domestic economies that have the fiscal space to do so recovered from this situation with stimulus-led programs that are linked to our climate and development goals, that not only would countries get higher growth levels and lower their debt, but it would enhance their creditworthiness. And, that's exactly what we do in the North, right? Since COVID, we've had about $17 trillion in expansionary fiscal and monetary policy to get ourselves out of these crises. Ironically, The opposite is what the IMF conditions on a country. Rather than having expansionary policy, they have to have austerity or fiscal consolidation. This new Brookings paper shows that a set of programs that sort of mimic what we do in the North, but that is specifically linked to this, what's called the Songwei-Stern report about the financing needs that we need to move forward into the future, that countries would be much better off in terms of financial stability, creditworthiness, growth, and be on a path towards low-carbon development. Now, to get to the South African conversation, we can't have infrastructure that's not climate resilient and low carbon moving into the future. Those will be stranded assets. They will be more susceptible to climate shocks like what happened in Durban about a year ago. And so there isn't a trade-off. What the problem is that the cost of capital is a little bit higher to make these upfront investments and the upfront costs in general to make some of these investments in a sustainable infrastructure that's low carbon, socially inclusive, and climate resilient. And so the major challenge for the international financial system over the next decade is to bend down that cost of capital so the countries aren't in massive debt distress while they're investing in a future. The Songwei-Stern report, if we're putting 4.5% of GDP per annum into the developing world, into sustainable infrastructure, it'll bring higher levels of growth. It will allow countries to be much more resilient to the kinds of climate and external sort of financial shocks that we've had over the past few years and pandemics, of course.
But who's putting 4.5% of GDP into the developing world?
No one is, right? No one is.
I mean, I think the U.S. is putting 0.001% into its foreign assistance, much less 4.5%.
This is the crisis of multilateralism right now, that the multilateral system is hijacked by U.S.-China conflict and the lack of an ethic that the advanced economies had from the late 1950s until the early 1980s, that a prosperous world economy would lead to a more peaceful world economy and that we'd all be in the same boat. Now we're really in a beggar thy neighbor world where the advanced economies are really just looking out for themselves. That's what we've had since COVID, with export controls on PPEs related to the vaccines, to not sharing vaccines, not allowing countries like South Africa to produce their own vaccines, to climate finance, and to the not buffering the impacts of the ever rising interest rates in the advanced economies. This debt crisis, sometimes people forget, like, what are the origins here? The origins here are the more than a decade of easy money from the United States and the advanced economies of ultra low interest rates. That was really good on some levels for developing countries because the low interest rates in the North created a surge of foreign investment in developing economies and contributed to economic growth and the appreciation of exchange rates. Things were starting to get a little unsustainable, though, right before COVID. And then once COVID has happened, there's just been a polycrisis of external shocks on developing countries, most of which they've had nothing to do with. First was COVID itself and the supply chain shocks and the fact that the Federal Reserve protected itself and put together all these swap lines with the other advanced economies. That was the first trigger of massive capital outflows from the developing world and a depreciation of their exchange rates that ballooned foreign currency debt. Number two was Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where that also rattled markets, created a flight to safety to the dollar, and obviously has raised prices for food and fuel for so many countries that they have to come up with ever more foreign exchange to be able to pay for those vital imports. And the climate shocks in Durban, in Nigeria, in Pakistan, across the Caribbean have been another one. And the hair that's broken the camel's back is the United States, followed by advanced economies, unwinding of that easy money and the increase in the interest rates. Increase in interest rates has caused even more capital flight, more depreciation of currencies, and has really put the developing world on the brink. And we're so focused on our domestic politics and our U.S.-China conflicts that we're not investing in these institutions to really take on the world's challenges. And without doing it, we're all going to be worse off. With respect to China and the World Bank, I wish China had nominated someone to be the head of the World Bank. China is the world's development miracle of the late 20th and early 21st century, and would probably have somebody that could bring some real experience and a breath of fresh air into an institution that's been plagued for a long time. But when the United States put out a candidate, just hours after out of the gate, that sent a signal that we weren't really going to change our policy, where there's a gentleman's agreement where the United States always names who the head of the World Bank is, and the Europeans always name who the head of the International Monetary Fund was. And so that sent a chilling effect to the rest of the world. And developing countries did not spend political capital in a time where they really have their hands and their tin cups out and to try to challenge it. And so we likely have Mr. Bonga, who does have some experience in organizing very large institutions. He's going to have a steep learning curve when it comes to development issues and development finance. And he's really going to have to deliver on a stepwise capital increase of the World Bank in a very polarizing environment in the United States government. He does have strong ties to the Republican Party, and so maybe he can get that capital increase in a way that other nominees might not. We need to support him now that there isn't another candidate. He's got a lot on his shoulders, and there are so many alternatives now. If he doesn't step up and the shareholders don't support him, remember, the president does not have a lot of power. He doesn't sit there and make all the decisions at the board. Those are still done by the major shareholders. And so the onus is really still on them. And now, this is a China podcast. There are many alternatives for developing countries now. They can go to private bond markets. They can go to the China Export-Import Bank. They can go to the Development Bank of South America. They can go to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And so this is really the test of time for the World Bank. Can it reform itself? Can it bend down the cost of capital? And can it address those needs that the South Africans are saying that you mentioned, to not only invest in the infrastructure to be able to get the kind of growth that we need, but to get countries on low carbon, socially inclusive, and climate resilient growth paths that'll make us all better off and won't make us trade off short-term gains for long-term costs.
So just following that logic, one of the big challenges I think that everyone is facing now is these kind of fundamental challenges to how this financing system has worked, how development financing has worked, and these kind of central roles of the World Bank and the IMF. Once that centrality starts breaking down, like what are we looking at? Like, kind of, as you mentioned, that there's, kind of this around like in the 60s of countries facing debt distress. Once that kind of, once that, if they don't get helped in time, and what are the kind of first signs of systemic breakdown that we should be looking at?
Well, we're watching it now. We have a multitude of creditors out there with different strategies. We have the United States, starting with the U.S., where we've done all these swap lines with politically and economically determined sort of criteria of who gets it. The rest of the world either has to go to the IMF under the conditions that we talked to. There's been a number of interesting studies over the past couple of weeks that show that sort of China is building its sort of a parallel situation where they're bailing out certain countries and offering swap lines, which are two different things, and also engaging in their own level of debt relief outside of this. That's fragmented. That's not a multilateral system. That is a fragmented system, which puts the developing countries even at more of a disadvantage. In terms of this specific, we're having a conversation here about some real cracks in the multilateral system that started about 40 years ago, but are really unraveling in front of us. We all have to have an ambition to try to reform this system, but that doesn't happen overnight. And we also need to reform some of the emergency measures that we have to give the multilateral system some credit for in establishing over the past couple of years. I already mentioned the issuance of special drawing rights of $650 billion in August of 2021. That was landmark and historical, as was the recycling or rechanneling of some of that, because as we know, the poorest countries only got about 21 billion of that. But to the West's credit, or the advanced economy's credit, they have rechanneled some of it. They pledged to rechannel 100 billion. They're nowhere near that, but some of it has gone to the PRGT at the IMF and this new Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and some of it will seem to be going to the African Development Bank. The other thing that was set up was called the Common Framework, which we haven't named in this podcast, but we've obviously been talking about it the whole time, which was a recognition in 2020 that one of the most glaring gaps in the multilateral system is the lack of a sovereign debt workout arrangement. We need a treaty-based sovereign debt workout arrangement, but that's not going to happen in the middle of this crisis. And Like I said, there's three flaws in the common framework. Number one, that countries like Sri Lanka, Suriname, if Kenya, Pakistan, Bolivia, and Ecuador are not far behind, they won't be eligible for the common framework either. The second one is that all these creditors are pointing fingers at each other, and it's hard to negotiate. In the 1990s, it was really just the Paris Club, the multilateral development banks, and a handful of commercial banks in New York and London that the presidents and prime ministers of those two countries could strong arm to get to the table. We're in a much different situation now with, in the developing world, 44% of all of the debt in developing countries is held by private bondholders and folks like you and I who might have pensions invested in these countries, and we don't even know. 21% is from MDBs, 6% from the Paris Club, and 4% from China. That's a lot of different people that need to be at the table. We, in our proposal, Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery, go back to history and propose a Brady Bond-like arrangement where we have carrots and sticks to bring these different creditor classes to the table. In terms of carrots, if we used guarantee fund to guarantee the newly restructured bonds so that at least bondholders and Chinese commercial creditors, when they did restructure, they knew that they would actually get the new level of bond after the restructuring. That would be an important carrot that really worked in Mexico and Brazil in the 1990s. And you'd have to couple that with sticks, lending into arrears, a standstill on payments during negotiations and for a certain period afterwards, which last week, one of the things that went overlooked is that Malpass actually endorsed that, and other measures in terms of sticks to get these folks to the table. There are upwards of 69 countries that are in debt distress, and that list of countries increases every single day. And there's over 1 billion people that are suffering right now. And because we need to make such huge investments in a climate-friendly development path, we're all going to suffer moving forward. And unfortunately, the multilateral system is not fit for this purpose at this time. And we have to be working on all fronts with a vision of large reform, but what small incremental gains can we get every day while thinking about the people in Zambia and about future generations at the same time?
It's interesting that you bring up this question of the revived reformed Brady Bond for the modern era. Your colleagues at the Global Development Policy Center, economists Ying Qian and Yan Wang, wrote a paper back in 2022 about the Shanghai model and how there is an idea of also taking some of the Chinese debt and collateralizing it and doing something similar to what they did with the Brady bonds. So interesting that this might be an area that we can incorporate both Chinese solutions and non-Chinese solutions. So that's just something very interesting to consider. Very quickly before we go, only because time is running out, you talked about currency swaps, and I want to kind of just touch on that very briefly because you wrote a paper for us as well as on the GDBC website, Getting Currency Swaps Right, How China is Filling the Void Left by the West. This article came out at the same time as reporting that the Chinese have paid as much as $240 billion of currency swaps to help distressed countries around the world. Many of those headlines were saying that, well, this is indicative of the problems that the Belt and Road is having. This is indicative also of Chinese lending gone awry. You contend that these currency swaps also perform a constructive purpose. Can you tell us a little bit more about this question of currency swaps and what, the layman is supposed to understand from it?
Yeah, well, there are just webs and webs of currency swaps all across the world, from what are called the big advanced economy central banks, but also across Asia and across the world. And to single out China's as somehow being a problem is a little concerning. On our webpage at the Global Development Policy Center, we have something called the Global Financial Safety Net Tracker, where you can look at all the different swaps and different kinds of liquidity arrangements in what's called the global financial safety net. And it's a fragmented system. The IMF should be at the center of it, but there are currency swaps from the Fed, from the ECB, from Japan, from all across the world. And China, to its credit, has stepped up into the game and has offered swaps to countries around the world to help them backstop their economy in general and their trade with China. It's not ideal. The G20 should be working to coordinate these things, but it isn't happening. And it's important for China to protect its interests. Yes, it's not that the Belt and Road is going bust. It's that the developing world is going bust, and that China is a relatively small amount of those overall loans that are going bust. 4% of the debt stock of the developing countries relative to 44% of the private bondholders. But China's paying a bigger price because, its leader in this is the Export-Import Bank of China, which is by definition an international bank, where it only lends to foreign countries or to its own companies to export to foreign countries. And so its balance sheet is heavily exposed to the international situation, whereas PIMCO and Standard Chartered and some of these firms are much more exposed to the advanced economies, where their balance sheets in developing world are relatively small. And in the advanced economies, they are being heavily protected by these dollar-denominated swaps and euro-denominated swaps.
We've covered a lot of ground. A lot of your work focuses on climate, the nexus of climate and development and debt, and how, as we discussed earlier, also as you mentioned in an interview with Reuters earlier in April, that around $520 billion in debt needs to be written off to help developing countries to not only become fiscally more, more sure-footed, but also to meet climate and development goals. So, that is a big ask. And I was wondering how you look at the future, knowing this realities, how worried are you? And how panicked are you? And do you get a sense that people in the IMF and the World Bank, people meeting at these G20 meetings and so on, are they feeling the panic?
They are slowly feeling the panic, and I'm worried about the future, but I'm inspired by parts of our past. This is starting to look exactly like the late 1990s, when the developing world was in acute debt distress and country after country was defaulting on its loans, and we were looking forward at the multilateral development goals, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and saying there's no way that we're going to be able to meet these. And we need to have drastic action. And it took a long time. It took until the late 1990s, almost 15 years after, a decade and a half of restructuring and IMF programs and structural adjustment. And finally, the international system said, if we don't do debt relief and a whole bunch of other corresponding policies, it's going to affect us all morally and economically. And we're there now. And there is a consensus at the very top levels that the mechanisms to get us there aren't happening, but all the United Nations agencies all are sounding the alarm on this now, and independent academics and civil society organizations are. And it really takes that outside pressure to move these international institutions that are dominated just by a couple countries. And that's what happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s, is that civil society and thought leaders around the world really pushed these institutions to take bold action. And that's what's needed now, to really look at the resource mobilization needs for our development and climate goals, that if we don't make those investments, not only is it bad for the livelihoods of so many people in the developing world, but it also will hinder the entire global economy. So there's actually more of an impetus and a rationale to take big investment action now, because the cost of that inaction will hurt us all and be much larger than the short-term price of making the kinds of investments that we need. And so I'm part of a growing and loud chorus at the United Nations and civil society organizations and the expert community, which is pushing for global reform, pushing for global mobilization of resources. And, as someone who goes to these meetings every 6 months, there is now a consensus that the system is broken for this. There is now a consensus that there needs to be massive resource mobilization, and all eyes are really on the major shareholders and to see if they can really think about their own futures and make these investments and think about ways to overcome the real geopolitical barriers within their countries and across countries that are holding them back. And it takes leadership. And that's what's really missing in the multilateral system right now. Everyone's been pointing fingers at each other, but they're surrounded by a growing community that's pointing fingers at them. And I just hope that we don't do too little too late like we have so much in the past. We really need a Glen Eagles-like moment which I was heartened to say here at the end of the IMF meetings that at least the IMF director for Africa was able to step up and say that. And that to me was a silver lining at the end of an otherwise fairly dark week when you have an official like that saying, this is something that really has to be done. And so that's what gets me up every morning is to these small increments of change that can help us orchestrate serious reform for the betterment of the people of today and the planet tomorrow.
Well, we're grateful for the work that you and the team at the Global Development Policy Center is doing. Kevin Gallagher is the director of Boston University's Global Development Policy Center and also a professor of Global Development Policy at Boston University's Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies. Kevin, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy day to join us. If people want to follow the work that you and the team are doing at GDPC, where can they find them and where can they find you on Twitter?
Well, I'm at Kevin P. Gallagher. And the GDP Center, if you go to our webpage, www.bu./GDP, you can see our Twitter. Also, this debt group that I'm part of, Debt Relief for a Green and Inclusive Recovery, is drgr.org. Keep an eye out on us on Twitter. And we've got a whole bunch of reports on all these issues that we've been talking about. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. And don't worry about writing all those addresses down. I'll put them all in the show notes for everybody to click on so everybody will be able to find it easily. Kevin, thank you so much again for your time.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Cobus, it is so refreshing to hear Kevin really inject that urgency into the discussions. And let's bear in mind, this is a guy who, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, is in the room. He gets to talk to the people at the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, even the U.S. government as well. Well, he's saying a lot of what I've been saying over the past couple of years of we gotta move. The time for talking is over. And I worry, though, that talking is not easy in this day and age, especially between the United States and China, where it's hard to get anything done. And not to mention how the Indians and the Chinese have problems. And so if we need to pull together, that is a very, very difficult challenge. And I have not seen that the global South and developing countries are a priority in any of these global North countries. So I'm not entirely sure the future is that bright.
Yeah, I mean, I share your concern. One of the things that makes me worried is that I think the global North, and by this I mean actually more specifically Europe and the United States.
The G7 countries, right?
Yes. Over the last few decades, I think it's just become such a kind of assumption, I think, in those societies that certain countries are just gonna be poor. That kind of massive wealth gap and what we've seen as spreading wealth gap that is now increasingly also coming to define those societies themselves, is that wealth gap is just structural and to a certain extent even moral. Kind of that there's thinking, particularly among in the right, in those countries that somehow there's a kind of that is just kind of like a divine mission or a divine kind of allocation to these countries, that some countries are rich and well developed and the rest of the world is just poor and that's just how it is. Bridging that kind of entrenched bias, I think is a really kind of core part of this issue. And to kind of challenge that assumption, I think is really important.
You know that something's going to change. The next time that we have a senior U.S. official, whether it's even Biden himself, go to Africa, not mention Chinese debt, because as Kevin pointed out, the Chinese account for 4% of global debt stock and only 12% of Africa's debt stock. And if you recall from previous discussions we've had on this show with various stakeholders, that it wasn't Chinese debt that was sinking Sri Lanka or even Ghana, but it was the private creditor debt. So something's going to change when you have a U.S. official who turns around and says, I am going to introduce legislation into the Congress or into a state legislature like New York that will ease up on the fiduciary requirements for companies like BlackRock to negotiate debt settlements. Okay? Until that is done, which I don't think it's going to happen, but until that is done, I don't think we can take the U.S. seriously on this issue. because they're just scoring cheap points against the Chinese. Sure, yeah, the Chinese are not transparent. The Chinese are bad. I get it. Sure. But there's a lot of actors, and everybody's pointing fingers, as Kevin pointed out. And one of the things that I think would boost U.S. credibility enormously is if they said, okay, we have a stake in this as well, and we are going to make sure that our stakeholders, which in this case are the Wall Street firms, are going to do what they can do, and we're going to make it easier for them to do that. Until that happens, I just don't take them that seriously.
But of course, in order to make that happen, one first needs to take the Global South seriously. One first needs to take Global South problems seriously. And that I feel...
Okay, but listen, give the Americans credit where they're due. I mean, at least Africa now is a talking point in Washington that people do take seriously. I mean, given we've just had the vice president there, we've had any number of cabinet secretaries there, they had the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. They're talking about it now. And they're committing real money to it. $55 billion, $11 billion a year of humanitarian assistance. That's not chump change. That's taking it seriously, right?
Yeah, it's certainly encouraging, but I think the real test, is still coming, particularly around debt, I think. The real kind of commitment feels like it's still really lacking. And one worries what kind of crisis it's going to take to change minds.
The other issue that I want to bring up, and I didn't have a chance to ask Kevin about this, and I'd like to ask him or maybe some other guests, is that I spoke with a source last week who explained to me that China Exim Bank, even if it wanted to forgive the debt, is not actually bureaucratically set up to do so. There's an enormous amount of internal reforms that have to happen within the Chinese development finance system to write off debt. So part of it is a moral issue that the Chinese culturally do not like canceling debt, but part of it is also a structural issue. And I would love to find out from somebody on the inside who can tell me more about how these institutions are set up, because they were never designed to cancel debt. This was not part of the plan 15, 20 years ago. I don't think they foresaw that they were going to be in the situation today that they're in. And they never thought maybe that they were ever going to be this big either. So again, and that's what makes me a little bit dubious about these big breakthroughs from the Chinese at the spring meetings that everybody was talking about. And I was like, ooh, let's wait and see a little bit. There's a lot that needs to be unpacked here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if one steps back several steps, then I think it's also becoming clear that we're at some kind of unique, as Kevin was saying, we're at some kind of unique historical inflection point where the system itself is going to have to massively reform in order to keep functioning. And that's true for the IMF and the World Bank, but it's also true, I think, for the Chinese financial system, because they're now in this kind of unprecedented place, where suddenly, obviously, in Africa around 2016, they were lending, their levels of lending was equaling that of the World Bank. They've, so part of this kind of continual, reform or the kind of crossing the river by feeling the stones kind of way of moving towards greater and greater international prominence that we've seen, the Chinese do over the last while. This is going to be one of those areas where they're going to have to pivot and reform and change the system and so on in order to adapt to their own current position. This is the what we're actually probably seeing, is really the kind of birth pains of a new international system, kind of one where this kind of new superpower is now a superpower and has to kind of act accordingly, and in the process, changes itself as the US has done in the 20th century,
or the collapse of an old international system.
Yeah, which also kind of also might happen at the same time.
I mean, we don't know yet, right? Let me just put a little warning sign out there for you. My son's school here in Ho Chi Minh City just got a notice from the local government, from the Ho Chi Minh City government, that now is reinstituting a mask mandate because we've had a COVID upsurge. And I think it's a sobering reminder that COVID is not gone. And so he talked about the health pressures that are bearing down on some of these countries. And you look at a country like Kenya right now that is just sucking wind financially, that the currency is weak, that the debt repayments are going up. Nigeria is having problems as well. And then let's not forget that COVID is still a part of this. Now, whether or not African countries get hit with COVID, which they were spared for the most part. But if Vietnam or if China or if other parts of the world that impact the global supply chain and the global economy start to go back into shutdowns again or have some disruptions, we can't take that off the table. We just can't take that off the table. So it's very sobering here in Vietnam right now, where more people are wearing masks, more people are talking about getting sick. Maybe it's not about getting deathly sick, but it's disruptive nonetheless. So just something to think about there. Listen, we went really wonky today in the show, and we do this actually on the debt issue because you can't understand this unless you lift up the hood and put your head in the engine and find out what's going on. It's not easy to follow. We understand that, but it's one of these topics that if you just kind of stick with it, you start to learn about the ins and outs and all the different things that Kevin was referencing. We're going to have more shows on this in the weeks ahead. But if you're interested in this, and it is absolutely fascinating, I mean, this is where the story is right now in many parts of the Global South, then you're going to want to subscribe to the work that Cobus and the team are doing every day at the China Global South Project and our daily Global South Digest that we produce, focusing on what China's role in all of this. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You can try it out free for 30 days. And then after that, it's a very modest rate. The subscription fees are not much. We also offer students and teachers a 50% discount. Just email me at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com and I'll give you guys the discount codes. Please be sure to use your student email addresses or your academic email addresses when you send me that email. So let's leave the conversation there, Cobus. We'll be back again next week with another episode of the China Global South podcast. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGSProject and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.